In this lecture, we need to talk about researching literature, specifically going about choosing your topic. Now, sometimes when people hear that they need to do research in literature, they think it's something difficult to figure out where to start, and they'd really rather have a more open topic. Now, in 1301, you likely had a research paper that was more of an open topic. If you took my class, you were allowed to choose your own topic. Here we're narrowing down. You're going to do research within literature. Now that's not as scary as it could sound. So let's look at some of the options that you might choose as a general guiding principle for your topic. Now, literature topics vary in what we research. Two students could research the exact same work of literature, whether it's a book or a poem or a short story or a play or what have you. And by going through different avenues, they would come up with very different ways of looking at the literature. Basically, when you're doing a research project in lit, you are trying to discover something about the particular work or about the particular genre and answer a question that you don't know. Okay, so you might look into the presentation of an idea and look at how it's presented between genres or even within the same genre at different times. For instance, the idea of a vampire is something that has been in our literature for a very long time. The first English written vampire story, or English language written vampire story, would be The Vampire by Dr. John Polidori, dating back to the 17th century or early 18th. And we have more recent vampire literature from the late 20th century and even here in the early 21st century. And you might look at how a vampire is presented and what's different between the old methods and the new. For instance, you might look at the difference between the way Bram Stoker presents Dracula and the way Anne Rice presents Lestat. Now, you could also look at the difference in a single idea between genres. All that a genre really is a framework for presenting a story. As such, you can tell a civil rights story in a Western novel, and you can tell a civil rights story in a science fiction novel, and you can tell a civil rights story in a fantasy novel. It doesn't have to be in a contemporary novel. So you might look at things like that, where an idea is presented different ways across genres. Perhaps you would be interested in the commentary on society. Good literature makes comments about society. Okay. You might look at, for instance, gender roles in novels or short stories. You might look at how they are presented in different places, or aspects. You could focus on a single novel and discuss the politics or the gender roles or societal norms. Any of that would count as commentary on society, and these are things that you can do research on. Even though it seems like something that's very small, these projects can get fairly large fairly quickly. And you might also want to look at criticism. Now, I'm not asking you to do criticism, but you might want to look at the historical criticism of a piece and what modern eyes see when they look at the same piece. Some pieces have been around for long enough that we interpret them in different ways now than when they first came out. In fact, quite a number have. You might look at the difference between how these different time periods looked at the exact same piece. For instance, we're reading Huckleberry Finn this semester. And when Finn came out, it was considered um, a novel not for children as much as a novel for adults. Now we think of it as part of Twain's children's literature collection, but it's really not a kid's book when we look at the complex political and social aspects within the book. In some places, this book was condemned because Huckleberry is treating Jim as a person. And, here we are 100 and some years later, and some people say that we should remove the book from the canon because it uses a word we no longer find acceptable. And people look at the book as though perhaps Twain was the racist instead of Twain making commentary about the racism within society. Now, don't do Huck Finn because I've given you that idea, and we're going to talk about Huck Finn extensively this semester. But it's just an idea of something you could do. You might also look at the historical background of your chosen piece. For instance, sometime back I did a paper on Shakespeare's Hamlet. And in looking into the characters, what I found is that in their own time, when this was written, each of them would have been considered ultimately would have been considered a failure. And by looking through how society saw princes and kings and queens and students and soldiers and so on and so forth, what I was able to find was that it's a tale of elite people, but ultimately all failures. You might also look at why the piece was written. Some books, some plays were written in response to something else. For instance, Cannery Row by Steinbeck was written because of labor practices that that the author found absolutely well, they were dangerous and selfish by the plant owners, and Steinbeck found those labor practices to be abhorrent. So he wrote a book called Cannery Row, and it's about such things. Okay. You might look at the cultural context of a novel. how culture has influenced that novel. Like I said, with Steinbeck and Cannery Row, that was more of a historical context, but still, it's part of culture. Great Gatsby is another example where culture has influenced the novel. But you might also look at the influences that the particular piece of literature had on culture. Because um, while life does influence art, art also influences life. Okay. You should look at how presentation changes the perception of the text and changes the perception of the story. When we take a text to film, how does that change things? When we take a radio play to film, how does that change things? And when we take a staged play to film, how does that change things? And how, when a text goes to radio play or stage, how is it changed? You can look at those types of things for your research. Now, none of this is going to be quick. This is an 8-week project, so there will be some in-depth research on your part. And the last one that I want to talk about, now this isn't the last avenue of research you could take, it's just the last suggestion that I'll make here, is characters. Okay, you look at the characters. What is the character's place in society? Are the characters out of their place in society, as you might find in some novels? For instance, in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, we do find that some characters are out of their own place in society, not always to their own benefit. Are the characters representations of real people, recognizable people? That also can be seen in multiple novels. In Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes, we find that there is a master blackmailer who is almost exactly modeled off of a real famous blackmailer of the time that Doyle was writing. Also, characters can be lessons or models of humanity. When we see a character who is in a station higher than us act well, such as a king or a queen or a prince, and they act in a good way, that can be a model of how we are supposed to act. When we see them act poorly, that can then set up a lesson on why you do not act that way. You can look at all sorts of things with characters. Hopefully, this has given you some idea of a few of the avenues you can take to research literature. Ask questions, please. If you see something that maybe you might like to research, it probably is a good idea, so just talk to me and we'll see if we can refine it down into something. Remember that your general ideas and your direction is going to be due at the end of week 2. Your basic topic. So start really nailing those things down now. And again, if you have any questions, just ask me. If you want to get a hold of me over email, that would be anelso17@epcc.edu.